Yes, thanks for joining us. August 2019 OpenZFS Leadership Meeting. We have a few things on the agenda. I will kick it off with the OpenZFS Developer Summit. So yesterday was the deadline to submit talks for the OpenZFS Developer Summit. I got a whole bunch of interesting talks that I think you guys will all be excited to hear. But if you were thinking about submitting a talk and didn't, then let me know right away. I'll finalize the schedule in I think 2 weeks. So let me know within that time if you forgot to send me your talk on time. Did anybody think that they were going to send me a talk but then did not, or want me to reconsider their talk? Okay. Hopefully everybody found my email. The next topic was about a different conference that Seraphim wanted to ask about.
Hi everyone. George Wilson and I will be at Linux Plumbers this September, September 9th, I think, to September 13th or something like that. It's basically a conference that if you're like a kernel developer and you're working on Linux and you have stuff to talk about or discuss and connect with other individuals, like this is the place to be. George and I have submitted kind of like an open discussions for kernel debugging specifically, but it would be interesting to hear if other folks from, at least from this community, will be also there.
Anybody else planning or thinking about going to that conference?
Okay.
All right. Well, if you hear about any of your coworkers going, let Seraphim or George know. You guys can meet up and talk to ZFS or strategize about how to engage about ZFS with the Linux kernel development community. Cool. The next topic that we had was, I think, from Andre. Are you on here? Yes, you are. Cool. About 32-bit non-atomic operations. Do you want to kick that off, Andre? Maybe he's looking for his mute button. All right, I'll give an introduction and see if Andre comes off mute. So I think that the issue here is that if you're running with a 32-bit kernel, looks like you found it. All right, go ahead, Andre.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, great. So yeah, so yes, let me continue the introduction. This is an issue that I discovered almost by an accident, and it seems that right now we use atomic operations to modify values that we treat as atomic. It could be reference counts or things like that, various stats. And but to read them, we use plain reads, like plain C assignment operation, and it seems that that works very well on 64-bit platforms because I mean that those atomic variables are 64-bit themselves. So that works well because 64 is a natural integer size, a natural processor integer size. And I think that usually, or maybe we even enforce it, those variables are properly aligned in memory, so it's not a problem. But on 32-bit platforms, those plain reads, I think they are implemented as two instructions, to fetch two 32-bit values from memory and then manipulate them further. So even if a 32-bit platform can provide a correct implementation of 64-bit atomics, there is no guarantee that those 34-bit atomic updates would play well with those plain reads of the values. And that's my concern. At this point, it's mostly theoretical. And I think that probably situations where that could cause a problem are quite rare, because it's not often that we like cross that boundary when like both halves of 64-bit value get updated at the same time. It's very rare, and for some things like reference counts, I think it's extremely rare, like when you have that many references, except maybe for some stats where like we use reference counts for stats. But I wanted like to hear a general opinion if we maybe should add some atomic read operation instead of those plain accesses, plain read accesses to 64-bit atomics. So that's it.
Yeah, I mean, Andre, that I think I agree with what you said. A bunch of those are probably my fault from way back in the day, and I don't know for sure that those can cause errors. And like you said, most of them are in they're in like code paths where we're just kind of reporting something rather than really taking an action based on it within ZFS. But I mean, it would still be wrong to give them the wrong answer there. So probably we should be introducing some atomic 64-bit read operation that would be able to be atomic on the 32-bit platforms using a similar kind of mechanism as the atomic increment with return value. Like you could implement it with a like atomic increment by 0 and return new value underlying operation.
I actually, when I was working on the ZFS compatibility layer a few years ago, I did this. I used compxgig8b to do the atomic reads. And it's super easy to implement. It just makes it all ugly because you have to put that everywhere you want to read the variable. The other question is, how many 32-bit platforms do we actually run on these days? I mean, I imagine there are still some, but it's a question worth thinking about.
Yeah, I think that there's probably a bunch of platforms that it does run on, like on FreeBSD and Linux, as you mentioned. But how many instances there are of those is probably very small. But if somebody cares about those, then by all means, like, go do it.
Yeah, I think that I don't have very good stats, and I'm not sure like if many people run ZFS on 32-bit, let's say PowerPC or something like that. But I think that i386 is certainly supported, and I have heard from people who use ZFS on FreeBSD on that architecture, Intel 32-bit architecture.
I just wanted to add that I wrote a separate thing just as part of a side project, and I had the same kind of issue, and I was able to quickly find and fix all of the issues just to, or just by doing a lot of copying and pasting, by taking the atomic structure, and instead of having it be like the kernel's actual atomic, I made it a struct that just wraps only the kernel's atomic structure, and then you can't set it with just a regular value. Like you can't just assign it to, I don't know, 63 or whatever you want it to be. And so it makes it so that it won't compile if you try to do that in the future, and therefore it made it really easy to find all the places where that wasn't true. Just throwing that out there.
Yeah, that's a good idea for like kind of a compatibility layer or something that we would use for those atomics instead of just using uint64s, to use some struct that you have to go through, like a ZFS increment atomic, ZFS decrement atomic, ZFS get atomic kind of wrapper routines on the struct. That's cool. I like using the compiler to tell us where our bugs are.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that I see a path forward, and I think I will discuss this issue further first with FreeBSD developers in terms of what we want to do and what actual platforms we still want to support for ZFS, and maybe we will try to sort of spearhead this effort on FreeBSD, and then propose some changes common for all platforms.
Cool.
For all flavors of ZFS. Yeah.
All right, thanks. George, do you want to talk about the ZFS share-a problems and hacky solution that you've been working on?
Sure. So I think we wanted to kind of just share a little bit of kind of what we're learning with ShareNFS and Linux, and also kind of plug a lightning talk that we submitted for the OpenZFS Developer Summit. But so what we've seen most recently is instances where if you're using like the ShareNFS property and relying on the ZFS share-a functionality, which is a service, it's a systemd service on Linux. If you're using that, you can run into situations where you can get stale file handles. I don't know how many people are from the Linux side are actually doing this, but definitely on Delphix we saw this. You can get it from either restarting the NFS server or even rebooting like the NFS server. So in both cases, it kind of show up. And what we uncovered is kind of like the way that the ZFS functionality was kind of plumbed into systemd is a little bit cumbersome. There's not a real natural way to do it. It's a lot cleaner on Illumos, where we can rely on kind of the SMF services and dependencies to be able to plug into it, and there's closer hooks into like the NFS functionality directly from like libshare that doesn't exist very cleanly on Linux. And so as part of like the investigation, what I found was that the way that the service dependencies are laid out is we have when the system boots up, you have like a mountd service, there's an NFS server service, and those things will start up first, and the ZFS share service wants to start it after NFS server is up. And primarily it does that because the way that in Linux you share services, and when you run ZFS share-a, it just forks and execs a bunch of like export fs commands. So it needs to have like the NFS service running so that anything that you're exporting now gets registered and can get shared correctly. The problem is that if a client happens to try to either remount or request a file system that it had mounted, it'll get a response back from like mountd, and the file system itself may not be shared yet, especially if you have a lot of file systems that you're trying to share out. You now have RPC mountd and an FSD that can respond, but you haven't completed the share-a component of it. So you end up with an stale. And what's weird is like, it's a momentary stale file system. If you try to access it after the share has completed, all of a sudden like it comes back. Although there's a lot of applications that don't like that at all. So so when we started going about trying to figure out like, okay, how best to deal with this, we came up with a pretty hacky approach, but it turned out to actually work rather well. And that was to introduce a new component to ZFS share So instead of using ZFS share-A, I introduced a ZFS share-G for generate. And the idea here from the Linux side is to try to make ZFS like closer tie and have a closer tie to the way that NFS exports. And so what I'm doing now is actually creating an exports file instead of relying on exportfs, the command to actually export these individually, that can then be consumed by the the NFS server. And I've changed the dependency ordering so that now on boot up, you simply run and generate this file and then have NFS server consume it. So you're guaranteed to always have the file systems exported by the time those services are up and running. So you no longer get the stale file handle. It's kind of a hacky solution, as Matt mentioned. It was a prototype to kind of get us out of a really kind of nasty condition, but we've found some really nice benefits from it. In particular, like running this on a system that had a lot of file systems, we went from like the share service taking 300 seconds to now taking 7 seconds. Our plan is to do a lot more redesign in this space that we truly believe will benefit the Linux community. But if there are others that are doing things on Linux and find themselves in situations where they're seeing these kind of weird things, feel free to reach out to the Delphix team. We can kind of share what we have right now. It is, like I said, a kind of a hacky solution, so it's not completely clean, and we're not ready to upstream it yet, but it's the beginning part and probably the foundation for a much bigger redesign of the way that the sharing works on Linux. That will be coming soon. So, and we'll go into more detail on this stuff at OpenZFS Developer Summit. There's a lot more problems that we've uncovered in the NFS space that Don and I can share.
Yeah, I think one thing we were wondering from folks in this call is if other people have run into this problem, and if you have solved that problem in similar or different ways. Then I think that would be good to know, both from our, like, how do we design a real solution to this, and also, I think it would be interesting to work with George and Don on the talk that they're going to do for the conference.
I will say that at Datto, we have solved the NFS compatibility, or the NFS use with ZFS stuff by just using NFS as it is without like the standalone version.
So you're not using the share NFS property at all, then?
No, we're not using any of that. So it might be nice if we could. There might be some benefits there. It might be nice if, like, we could actually have some control over that, because for what it's worth, we have had issues with NFS in the past, as I think everybody has, at least to some extent. But having some control over it, just because it's a part of the file system, would probably be a good thing. So, thank you.
So Tom, are you like putting stuff into Etsy share tab, or is it exports?
Yeah, it's Etsy exports.
Yeah. Okay, so you just put stuff into Etsy exports for your ZFS file systems, and then let the NFS server deal with it there, which is like kind of similar to what George is doing, but George is just saying, like, we're going to generate that file like at boot time from the properties in ZFS, right?
Yep.
Yeah, but we have like a whole, like, again, we just have like a separate thing, which I forget what we call it. I think we call it like XExport Manager or something. That that's whole job is just to do that, because we didn't trust anybody else to do it right. So, yeah.
In general, what George is doing sounds similar to what FreeBSD does, where we have etc ZFS exports, that is all the share NFS lines from all your file systems, and then when you change one, ZFS reloads mountd, and it rereads the file and updates its list of exported file systems.
How does FreeBSD generate that, Alan? Or is there like, is it like whenever ZFS share, if you do ZFS share NFS, it automatically generates that file for you?
Yes. And so I think your concept of having one command to refresh it all might actually be a slight improvement.
Yeah, I think
But
ultimately
we would be interested in.
Yeah, ultimately we want to be able to like have this individual updates in ShareNFS to actually do the same file. So it sounds like there might be a convergence happening between like what we're proposing for Linux and what FreeBSD has done. It's cool.
Cool. Yeah, it sounds like we Delphix folks should take a look at what was done for FreeBSD to see if like they already did a bunch of the stuff that we're thinking about doing.
I will say in FreeNAS, which is based on FreeBSD, or is, we avoided a huge class of problems because FreeNAS would never export things like /user, nor would it mount /user from an NFS share. And so we were able to move the NFS sharing way later in the boot process and kind of work around a lot of this. I don't know if that's generally purpose applicable or not. I don't think it would be, but we sidestepped the problem as well.
And that would probably work for like the Delphix appliance, since like we aren't doing that either. This is just for data,
Yep.
separate pool. But I agree that it might make it hard to integrate with like the typical installation of especially Linux.
Right, where you could NFS mount user.
Yeah. Or you could share, NFS share that.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Any more comments on share NFS? All right. In that case, Alan, did you want to talk about dedup stuff?
Just very briefly, I guess. We have a client who's using dedup at a very large scale, like 100 terabytes of data or so, and they're running into all of the problems that everybody knows about. And it looks like we'll actually have a budget to try to fix some of it. And so we're looking for anybody who might be interested in working with us via contract or whatever to actually implement some of the ideas you proposed in 2017, I think it was, during the hackathon, of having a ceiling, the limit on the size of the DDT, the idea of pruning entries that haven't deduped yet, that only have a single match to free up space in the DDT, and then the idea of doing the log-based approach to the on-disk format so that you have, 1,000x less IOPS every time you update the DDT. So if anybody would be interested in working on that, if you get in touch, we'll talk more.
Cool. I am not interested in working on that, but I'm happy to kind of go over the stuff that I had proposed and kind of help guide with next steps and whatnot if somebody is going to be working on it. And I'd love to see that kind of come to fruition.
Yep. And this will be done directly against the OpenZFS master. I guess the ZFS on Linux right now, but against master, and then the client will want it backported to 0.8, but that's their problem. But this would be open to everyone as it happens to.
Cool. All right, that brings us to the end of our scheduled agenda. Other topics that folks would like to cover today? There's a few things on the backlog. I don't know. I haven't heard much questions about these recently. So there's the feature platform or platform feature matrix, which I see a couple people just clicked on. I think that we discussed this maybe last time or 2 times ago. I think this is still useful, but less useful than it was before now that FreeBSD is switching to be based on the Linux code, so it'll kind of pick up all that stuff once that happens. And I know that Jerry has been updating this. Jerry Jelinek has been updating this based on his work of bringing new features to Illumos, which he's made a bunch of progress on that. But I think that this is fairly accurate now. And I think that we have people kind of working on getting everything in sync, which is great. Oh, I can move fast clone deletion to be integrated. I'll do that after this. Other questions or things that folks would like to discuss? Well, thanks for the link, Alan.
Yeah, I had to go dig it up. I wasn't sure exactly where it happened.
Yeah, I feel like half the time when I'm working in some unfamiliar code base, that's like the hardest problem half the time. Is like, I know that this is happening somewhere in this million lines of code, but where is it happening? All right, then we will have a record early ending of our meeting. And the next meeting will be, let's see, September 17th at the same time. Is that right? I think so.
Yeah, the last meeting we had was at 11, so
Yeah.
the next one will be
Cool.
at 1.
So it'll be September 17th at 1 p.m. Pacific, the same time as this one. And in between now and then, you should see I'll send out the acceptance notices for speakers for OpenZFS, and then that'll be posted on the website. So, and then we'll start advertising more generally for folks to register. Registration is open now, but we'll start kind of publicizing and pushing more once we have the speakers. I think that'll get people excited when they can see, all the cool stuff they'll get to learn about at the conference. And we'll see you in 4 weeks. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.